Salute, omnes, I am Ruminous, and today we are going over reliable mechanics in video games. Reliability is one of the most important things in your design. If the player cannot trust or rely on a mechanic to function, it limits the player's autonomy and also their trust, and thus the fun for the game. Reliability means that a game offering the ability to run will always give the player the ability to run, unless there are certain clear situations that limit that function. The growth, complexity, the types of missions or duties in the game should also be reliable. The player should understand how the game operates and how new enemies, levels, or obstacles will operate within the game. Reliability is intertwined with frames and pauses in actions and in the internal systems. If the player can perform an action repeatedly, or the enemies move at certain speeds, it needs to happen consistently and predictably. If there is a pause in the combo or a drop in speed, they also need to be predicted and clear. Story-focused games quite often have unreliable mechanics because they want the player to listen to the story rather than play the game. The Last of Us is full of points where the player is denied the ability to run, reload, advance, or do most actions while an important event is happening. However, this is not consistent as all these options are also permitted during other important events. It is unclear why or when the player will be limited, which can be frustrating for multiple reasons, primarily autonomy. Unreliable mechanics limit the true ability of the player. If the player cannot rely on a mechanic to work, they will often just refuse to seek the mechanic since they don't want to deal with failure or loss when the mechanic decides to not function for no reason. Unreliability removes control from the player, which in turn creates an atmosphere of luck rather than skill to the game, and so the player will get frustrated and not feel like they should even try fully since the game will decide their success, not the talent of the player. An unreliable mechanic can be one that's taught to the player that every yellow ledge can be climbed, but there are some yellow ledges which can't. Unreliable mechanics can also just be frustrating or stupid. Even if The Last of Us wants me to listen to this dialogue, why can't I reload all of my weapons or run to the end of this part to the barrier of the next section while the event is happening? Particularly for replays, unreliable mechanics make the game weak. Reliability does not require that all enemies, actions, and events behave the same, just that identical things should behave identically. The player should never guess when a mechanic or action will happen. If the player can climb ledges, the player should always be able to climb ledges unless there is a specific thing denying them the action, like spikes or a specific height. Reliability entails that the action or event will always happen under the same circumstances. If the character is invisible while in the shadows, enemies should not be able to see the character unless they inspect the shadow or have specific items to grant them better vision. Part of reliability is tight programming, the other part is intensive inspection to ensure that the rules or patterns are never broken without believable justification. Denying actions or mechanics just because to make the game harder or force the player to use different mechanics is lazy and often just obnoxious. Reliability also intertwines with consistency. Actions and systems should behave the same. Racing games will often have the leading cars be just behind the player once the player has surpassed them. This defeats the reliability because the computer drivers went from driving at predictable speeds and motions to having increased speed and abilities so that the player can be passed if a mistake is ever made. Following and trailing missions are notorious for this issue because NPCs will walk at a specific speed despite how fast or slow the player is moving. For chasing missions, the player is normally never able actually to catch the target, as the target will spontaneously jet forth and obtain speed until the player has reached a specific trigger. The same goes for trailing missions where the target or companion moves with the speed of erosion even if the conversation is about something urgent. This frustrates the player and makes the missions feel out of control of the player since the target can't actually be caught and any attempt is useless for chasing events, and trailing events feel stupid and often lack the drama or tension because the target moves at unrealistically slow speeds in severe situations, especially if the targets will move at faster speeds elsewhere in the game. If a character is transporting money or artifacts, they should be moving faster to get the mission done before any shenanigans can happen, like the player stealing everything. Reliability does not mean that all abilities and processes need to be available at all times. Sometimes the removal or locking of an ability fits the situation, but it should also not disrupt the flow of the game. Continuing with The Last of Us, if an enemy is recoiling at certain frames, the player's melee will miss even if it makes contact with the enemy. It's fine if the enemy is granted invincibility, much like the flashing sprites in older games, but there needs to be a clear sign when this happens. This also comes into play with action games where telegraph or movement of an enemy gives a clear sign to the attack that they will make. If the enemy moves too fast, or their different actions share similar movements, it becomes unclear what is happening and makes it difficult to engage without being overly cautious. Even though games should not be overwhelmingly easy, it is also important to make them fun and predictable to let the player react to situations accordingly. Reliability also extends to enemies. Enemies should be consistent with their actions and abilities. In stealth games, the movement and reactions of enemies is pivotal to the overall experience. The Last of Us has the enemies placed in determined locations but move in randomly generated patterns. What this does is allow the player to know where the enemies will be, but also that they will move and search in different places each time that they die. What is an issue with the game, however, is that the stealth is often artificial or ultimately useless. There are various points where the enemy is positioned in a way where it's nearly impossible, or even impossible, to sneak through the sections without being caught or killed. It is unclear where these sections are, such as Ellie's section escaping across the bridge where she is automatically detected if any enemy is left alive, compared to an easily escapable situation, such as Joel's trek through the university's dorms. The Uncharted saga has this issue as well, making it a common problem in the Naughty Dog's games, where stealth is a useful tool for saving ammunition and dwindling the amount of enemies, but cannot be used to completely avoid open conflict. God of War from 2015 has an incredible reliability for its actions, stats, enemies, and other mechanics. Every action that the player attempts is performed. Every time that an enemy attacks, the telegraph is unique and clear, but this does not mean that the game is easy. The game is rife with QTEs, and I would dare claim that it was this game that brought this craze into other games, but every QTE has the same time frames where they can be completed, and they're always responsive to the inputs. The enemies always know where the character is, and the game almost always gives the player enough time to not only see the enemy, but also look at the surrounding area for situational awareness, and also to see the type of enemy and the level of threat. The developers always made sure that the amount of enemies and types of attacks would never be overwhelming or arduous to overcome. The environmental dangers are lethal for spikes and pits, which are sensible when warned about with their corpses, but the rest are just damaging, like the saws. The player can attack whenever they want, besides certain clear animations, and pauses in the combo are clearly marked with a finisher. The player can always break the combo to block or dodge. Enemies always detect the player, meaning that stealth is never an option. The game always gives audio clues for enemies outside of sight to give clues to the enemies. Overall, the saga of God of War is heavily reliable and hardly feels as if the game is taking away autonomy from the player. The game never feels unfair or ridiculous except for that unforgivable atrocity of fighting 3,000 clones at once. That is the one area where the game is unreliable because it completely changes the whole feel of the game by adding too many enemies, too many different attacks, and implementing another way to die. In the effort to cater the gameplay to the story of protecting your family, the game takes away from its reliability and hinders the experience. Although these moments of introducing new events is not bad, it is necessary to make sure that it fits with the rest of the game and also learn from the weak areas in new projects. The Evil Within has wildly unreliable mechanics and controls. The game relies on stealth and action gameplay, but neither seem to work properly. The stealth, just like The Last of Us, is mostly just to avoid some enemies on the external regions, but the main region and gateways have enemies which will always see the player and make all the stealth seem utterly useless. Bullets often just pass through enemies, and this adds to the frustration because this horror game makes ammunition rather scarce. The bosses pretty much all have insta-kill moves, even outside of the insta-kill difficulty, and their movement is often too fast or telegraph is too obscure to be able to react to it properly. The player will then just constantly attack, as trying to evade the attacks is futile, which is a frequent issue in survival horror games. Generally, the combat works, but the design for the bosses and intangible enemies makes the actions and movement of the player uncertain. The game has traps set up throughout the world, and it introduces them at the beginning of the game in a fair way, but then begins to hide the traps under the water or smoke, which means that the only way to avoid them is to know that they are there. The first half of the game is designed to be for survival, where battles are usually optional or in short spurts, but the second half is all about battle and forces the player into frequent battles. The game is unreliable in terms of its flow and predictability. The game is pretty clear where there will be a boss encounter, but it is not always clear when, where, and which type of enemies will appear. The game goes through phases where 5 enemies will appear in a wave with just 1 advanced enemy, but then a wave of 10 will appear from all sides and all heights with various types of enemies. Overall, the mechanics or the programs and designs that interact with the gameplay should be consistent, fair, and sensible. Actions and gameplay can be limited, but there must be a reason besides, now it's harder. In essence, use common sense. Is this reasonable? Is this fun? Is this engaging? If not, try to find a way to make it so. Making grand changes to the way the game works for growth and/or difficulty feel cheap, and they hurt the engagement, immersion, and replayability. Sometimes it's best to make mechanics unreliable, to make the player feel uneasy or uncertain as the story becomes tense, but it needs to match with the game and the flow and everything else, and it needs to still play well in order to avoid frustration. Thanks everybody for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to like, subscribe, and ring the bell to be notified of future videos. If you have any constructive criticisms, things that you think that I missed, games that have either good or bad reliable mechanics, please put them in the comment section below so that we can continue this discourse. But until next time, wale te omnes.